Welcome back to the Teams Insider podcast. This week I have a conversation with a good friend, Shawn Harry. He's an independent consultant in the UC and collab space, has been in the space even longer than me. We talked about on the pod, has been coming to the London News Group with us for over a decade, and always have a good conversation with him. He's never afraid to share his perspective, particularly as an independent. We get into how the market has kind of evolved from us deploying server-based products to cloud-based products, some of the modern challenges of enterprises, particularly big enterprises, dealing with cloud, dealing with teams spanning over multiple kind of sub-products and integrations, and how project and operations can handle the constant change that is Microsoft Teams and Microsoft 365. Really hope you enjoy this conversation. I really enjoyed it myself. And many thanks to Audio Codes for supporting this podcast. Really appreciate all their support. On with the show. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the pod. This is one that, no joke, we've been trying to lock down for about 6 months because Shawn tries to tell me that he's too busy doing real work to come on a podcast. But, you know, we've locked him in now. Shawn Harry, I was trying to work out just before we jumped on to record when we first crossed paths. I feel like it was one of the early user groups. Was it before that? I don't know.
I think so. One of the very early user groups was, I remember winning, it's funny, I was doing some work with a SIP gateway the other day, and I think I remember winning the VVX 500 from that phone.
Yeah.
And I still have it. It's in the back.
That's crazy.
So I was trying to get it to register as a SIP gateway. So that would have been around about 2013, 2012, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, you've been a regular at the London User Group for too long for both of us to count, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, I know. I had hair then.
Yeah, we were all a lot younger. So for this pod, I'd love to have a conversation about kind of your history in our space, and you've always got decently strong opinions about what's going on, so I'm sure we'll get into some of that. But start us off from the beginning. I think is it Exchange or was it before Exchange? What was first?
Well, it's probably before Exchange. So I actually started off in electronics. I used to do test and repair. And then I realized quite quickly that there was no money in it. There was no jobs. So that's when I started getting involved with Exchange 5.5. And then obviously all the subsequent versions from there, 2000, 2003, SBS, 2007, yada, yada, all the way up to sort of 2016. But then I made quite a quick pivot into UC when I realized, so I don't know, you probably remember, right? So remember in Exchange 2000, you had the IM component. Yeah. And I remember installing it. I had no idea what it was, didn't know what it did, didn't have a clue, in fact. I was just mucking around. I used to have fairly extensive labs. So decided to install that. And I was like, oh, this is pretty interesting. I think it was called RTC back then, Real-Time Communicator. And it was I think it was the MSN. Yeah, it was the MSN client that you used to use for it, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, you were ahead of me because I was first doing Exchange so I didn't really hit until 2007.
Yeah, that was after.
Yeah, exactly. You are before it even broke out from Exchange. This is early.
Yeah. So in the early days, it was one. So it's funny because it went sort of full circle because with 5.5 it was monolithic. Then 2000 is still the same. 2003 was still the same, and 2003 was my favorite by far. And then 2007 came along. We broke out into the CAS and hub transport, edge transport, all that stuff. And then obviously that's when was introduced. I think maybe it was Service Pack 2, something like that, I think I want to say. And then obviously that's when we were doing all the link and OCS sort of integrations.
Yeah, that's when I came in because I was still on the Cisco side of the fence. So I was doing Call Manager and customers kept coming up being like, oh, we don't need Unity anymore. We're going to do Exchange So I got into, I didn't have any Microsoft background at that point. I came into Exchange and I did a bunch of and then it was like, oh, Microsoft are getting onto something here with OCS, and that's when I kind of jumped the fence.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, I must admit. I mean, I did that similar to yourself. I did a lot of integrations into SBCs, into Call Manager. I remember doing that as well. In fact, I've still got, so I'm looking at it right now. I've got, what is that? 7911 still sat on my desk, connected to Call Manager 7. I mean, I'm literally just surrounded by phones. That's all I do is make phones ring. And I've got squillions of them there in the back. So I remember this was in the very, very early days, like I said, of Real-Time Communicator, and I started dabbling with that. And then I discovered Skype. So then this is before Microsoft acquired Skype.
Yeah.
And I used to, and I'm off on a tangent here now, so now I'm going down memory lane. I used to have a little YPAC 2210. So you remember the PDAs? And it had a compact flash card in it, Wi-Fi. And I installed Skype on it. And I remember, and I got my mate, and I called him. I said, mate, this is obviously on my mobile. I called him on my mobile. I said to him, install this on your phone. This is a Skype client. You can do voice over IP. And I was just absolutely blown away by it. And I think this was around about 2004. And it was from then I just became a complete voice nerd. I was like, yeah, this is it. Who cares about Exchange? I'm just going to do voice for the rest of my life. And that's pretty much it.
It was nuts when it was the days where people were mesmerized by instant messaging in the business, and I can use this at home, and I don't even need a VPN, and then I can make a video call outside all that stuff was just brand new to people.
It's funny because I'm trying to remember with 2000, what was Net Meeting? That was it. It was called Net Meeting. Remember, it used to be baked into Windows 2000. And I used to do a lot of work with that at the time. So, like you said, you had the voice and video obviously on PC, and then obviously OCS came along, and then you had the there was like an OMA component. I think it was web based, if I remember rightly, or something. It's so long ago now, but I'm sure it was web based, and that used to run on your mobile, obviously Windows Mobile and so on. So yeah, and then obviously I've just moved on with the evolution of the product. So obviously into Link, then into Skype for Business, and then onwards to Teams. So that's pretty much all I've been doing for the last 20 plus years.
And is that
pretty sad, really?
Well, not in these circles, maybe outside, but we're all the same. Yeah. And you've been independent and contracting for a long time. Was that always the story? Did you work at any big shops? Or
no, So no, I actually started off initially on help desk, and then sort of gravitated into the whole sort of Exchange network engineer sort of piece. And then I went off sort of independent around about 2010. I think it was around about 2009, 2010, because I used to do a lot of work in the public sector, sort of NHS, that kind of thing. Lots of Exchange deployments, migrations, that kind of thing. I was pretty much subject matter expert for that, and moving them from 5.5 to 2003 NHS.net, and that was when 2007 days. And then, like I said, I got really sort of embedded around about when OCS really sort of debuted. I did quite a bit with LCS as well. I'm not gonna mention the names of the clients that I worked at, but lots of big clients.
You've done some really big shops, right? Like your roster, which obviously we can't share on the pod, is pretty impressive for the number of, and lots of FinServ and legal and like high profile brand stuff.
Yeah, you got. Well, it's funny because I ended up doing lots of your guys' deployments, like your previous place.
Yeah,
I'd always turn up at yours, and it always used to be deployments that either you or Justin had done, and then ended up having a sort of productionize and that kind of thing. But lots in the banking space.
We met across the table more than once where we knew each other personally, and it'd be like, oh, we're both in this account.
Exactly. Yeah, and here we are, sort of 10 odd years later, still doing the same thing. So
awesome.
Yeah, that's my backstory.
That's so cool. What's the today kind of are two questions, I guess. What are you working on right now? But also, like, our world has changed so much with Teams. What's your perspective on a Teams project versus what we used to do with a Skype for Business or Link project?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, for me, it's almost still the same. But I mean, I think the thing is with Teams, there's so much richness there within the platform and the ecosystem. Because if you think back to sort of, I guess, just before the pandemic, we used to talk a lot about feature parity, right? So you obviously had Skype for Business Online was still around. And some of the things, I don't know, like for argument's sake, front of house, there wasn't really anything really much in that space, in terms of attendant consoles, that kind of thing, as an example. And even phones, right? The phone story wasn't that great in terms of physical phones. MTRs were still sort of nascent.
Yeah.
We were still kind of gravitating, I guess, from LRS or SRS into MTRs. But now we've got a really, really mature tool. And I think I saw a post of yours the other day on LinkedIn, talking about Skype for Businesses. Obviously, I think 2025. I think
it's going to subscription edition. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and I have to think to myself, well, why would you still be on Skype for Business now? There's kind of really no need because every use case is completely resolved with Teams now. So
I think two things happened as well, because I think I spent a lot of time, when we moved from IP telephony to Teams, I guess Link and OCS, you spend a lot of time going feature for feature, like you said, that comparison thing. The pandemic was the last big thing that kind of reset does anybody care about the orange line key that flashes this color if this many people ring in on a Wednesday? All that stuff kind of fell away in enterprise. I felt like they were just like much more get the job done.
Yep. No, absolutely. For me, that's pretty much been the main bulk of my deployments. Like I said, I mean, I'm just trying to sort of think of the customers that have had sort of really sort of niche requirements. It's not really been a lot. It's pretty much, broadly speaking, everyone's got the same sort of challenge, which is kind of just get to Teams.
Yeah.
And all those really sort of smaller, fine. I mean, you look at Call Manager, an example. You've got hundreds and hundreds of features
Yeah.
there. From a team's perspective, we can pretty much do the bulk of what we need, with just a handful of settings, right? And the
And
reality
that
is
was
Teams
always what
very much
Microsoft advocated for. They were always like, do we
they
really
did.
need to rebuild these 400 features?
No,
And it pans out. I think there was a bit of meat in the middle. Like they've definitely backfilled some stuff that evidently was enough of a customer blocker, but they haven't backfilled nearly as much as what was on an older Avaya or a Call Manager.
And didn't need to, because again, the collaboration experience, ironically, is not voice centric, right?
Yeah.
It kind of starts with chat, it goes into collaboration, goes into documents, meetings. It's not really voice centric. So like I said, you don't need all those bajillion voice features, whatever that might be. I don't know. You need the basic stuff, MWI, cover to voicemail, auto attendant, call queues, and so on. But we don't need all the, like I said, all the features that we used to have on Avaya and Mito, etc. So pretty much, I would say that the use cases are broadly speaking the same. It's only when you get into the compliance, security space where things may get a little bit more complicated, and that's mostly around the regulatory sort of space, I would say. You tend to sort of see within banking. But again, there's solutions for all of that, right? We've got our Verbers and mnemonics, etc. In fact, there's even native capabilities within Teams as well, right? So in terms of the art of the possible, I think Teams has just got so much breadth now. Why would you waste your time with on-prem?
Yeah.
The world's moved on.
Yeah. And I know a couple of customers still running Skype, and it's a combination of long tail on their way off and or like some kind of, air gap kind of real edge case scenario. But I don't think there are that many even left now. Microsoft have to have a continuation story for those customers, but you're right. It's why would you do it to yourself in 2024?
Yeah, and it's just also a poorer experience, right? I mean, running Skype for Business, really? What, for chat? And you know what I mean? It just doesn't make much sense. We don't even remember we used to have, what was it called again? Remember the little modes? I've forgotten the name of it now. We had Teams only and the other mixed modes, Skype for Business plus, Remember that? I think it was about 4 or 5. I've completely forgotten the name.
Like the RCC type stuff, remote call control and...
No, not RCC, no. When you was in interrupt mode between Teams and Skype?
Oh, the islands and yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
Oh, that was messy.
Yeah, all of that. Exactly. That's what I mean. It's like some things work there, depending on what mode you're in, and you might get a chat here and you may get a notification there. All of that nonsense goes away. It was just always about get them to Teams only. It's nice and simple, So yeah.
So have you found your projects speed up? Because we used to spend a lot of time, we'd do 6 weeks of design work about server specs, and we were just talking off recording about the fun of kind of, you'd have to be able to at least go toe to toe in a conversation with the security team, certificates, identity, like firewalls, the exchange team, the AD team, because it's part of M365. Is that sped up in enterprise, or is there still a lot of back and forth?
No, it's. I wouldn't say it's sped up at all. I mean, if anything, the cloud actually introduces more different complexities, I would say, and potentially more complexity compared to on-prem. I think that what I tend to find in my space is that the breadth of M365 sometimes isn't fully understood by the various different teams, and in how sort of teams, or even just M365 as an entire stack, integrates so tightly. So it becomes like MTRs, as an example, is a much broader discussion than just simply about, the AV codec and what you might go for, what the room needs to look like, whether you need CD mics and so on. It's all the rest of that IT stack.
Yeah.
And when I start talking about conditional access or Intune or Exchange, literally they just glaze over kind of thing. It's like they wouldn't have considered half of these things. So the discussions do get quite interesting. And what I tend to see is gaps really in knowledge, I think, sometimes on the supplier side. And that's where I think the discussions tend to get quite interesting, because a lot of it is bringing people up to speed so they understand, okay, what things they need to consider, from a support and an operational perspective, as well as obviously the architecture itself, because there's a lot of moving parts. And Microsoft might say, it's just simply point click. Teams MTRs are easy, right? And they are conceptually, but that management itself, there's a lot of moving parts, and I think that's where the main bulk of the challenge I see. I spend a lot of time having to sort of not KT, but sort of drill knowledge into people, into various different teams, and that can be compliance, that can be security as well, and really get into the nuts and bolts of that as well. It's not sort of high level stuff; it's really sort of low level, nitty gritty detail stuff that level 500 almost.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting, isn't it? Because like enterprise IT was very siloed and towered. So this team looked after this thing, this team, and they've been forced to come together. And you're right. I think the knowledge and the culture is lagging. Where it's like what that team that owns SharePoint do is going to impact your workload, and what you're doing impacts theirs, and you're both controlled by AD and identity, and neither it's a whole new world. The other thing is and you touched on it there, the pace of change is like I talk about as jumping on a treadmill. Like you don't control it anymore. I don't think enterprises often get that either. They're like, oh, we'll just not do updates. Like, no, not really.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously with Evergreen, you don't have that choice. This is. Again, you don't want to be in a scenario whereby you end up with some kind of major incident because you missed a message or whatever in the message center or something, and that can happen. There's lots of stuff coming down the pipe for phones, for MTRs, updates that Microsoft are making are obviously that are quite impactful, and it's really staying in front of that because even though obviously the cloud needs less, well, actually. It's an argument that the cloud needs more watering and feeding than a non-prem does.
Isn't it funny? I think Microsoft have largely sold to the kind of C-suite. This is a giant cloud. We look after it. Credit card us, off we go. And the reality is actually you need the same amount of people doing different things. They're not deploying the service anymore, but now they're managing policies and change and that investment.
Precisely. Yeah, exactly. It's all of that. So it's like you said, it's the change management, it's the business change, it's the adoption, it's the training, it's the updating of documentation, artifacts, and all of that is one big giant engine. And it's almost like and again, to Microsoft's credit, they provide the message center which has a lot of that information. But what I tend to see is that a lot of organizations don't really have the product management or the SME knowledge or even the time, frankly, because they're busy closing tickets and firefighting to even deal and address with that. So when it comes to that water and feeding, half the time they're almost, kind of a few steps behind because they're dealing with MIs because of some change that Microsoft has made. It's definitely not as simple as, well, we're the cloud provider, we do all the updates and it's all hunky-dory. It's absolutely not that. So it would be good to see I think MTRs is probably a good example. We've got the rings obviously in the Pro Portal as an example, and that covers obviously updates for the Teams app as well as peripherals and other things that are plugged in and so on. But that whole story I think needs to come together more fluidly because organisations have change management, and they've got to try and sort of shoehorn that. And historically, that's always been a difficult thing to do in the when I say pre, I mean as in prior to the Pro Portal. Or prior to the rings that we currently have now, that was always a difficult thing to do, with the Teams admin center and Intune and so on. So, and it's building that whole workflow so that, those operations teams, wherever they are, because they might not necessarily be on-prem, they can certainly be offshore. They need all the relevant tooling. They need maybe remote access and so on and so on. And obviously the Pro Portal now has that, vendors can include that in their tools as well, but they need all the relevant tools so that they can go in and do all of that management, and it's not an easy job. It does require a lot of knowledge in all these different areas, as well as the necessary sort of integrations into the different technologies or the different groups to make sure that we can bring all of this together. So it's definitely a challenge. I'm absolutely seeing that out there in the field.
Yeah, MTR is particularly interesting, isn't it? Because you've got people, a lot of people from the traditional AV space, you've got people in the IT space, but all those other workloads can trip you up. The security team can trip you up, the identity team can trip you up, and you've got no visibility of that. And then you touched on it as well. If you've got multiple OEMs in play, now you've got different cycles of patching and firmware, OEM tooling. It gets decently complex pretty quickly.
Absolutely. And what I tend to see is that your traditional AV integrators are great at AV, but don't know anything about IT. And then conversely, your IT guys don't know anything about AV. And it's bringing those two worlds together so they understand, because again, the simplification might be, well, just go and create a resource account. Yeah, it's a straightforward thing, but 1 minute, there's policies that need to be attached to that. There's an identity here as well. We need to make sure that maybe certain conditional access policies are excluded. We may need to do some additional level of locking down and so on. So it's that whole thing end to end that needs to be considered. So and in fact, even the automation, the provision as well, that's been a challenge. I've certainly been involved in that, and that's not straightforward, especially if you don't have IDAM tooling. So yeah, the irony is, I think with the cloud, there's even more work for us, right? That's what I'm certainly seeing anyway. Certainly when we start looking at things like Defender and Purview and how all the components that we work with within Teams sort of bleed into those spaces too as well, because there's definitely tight integrations around things like guest controls and so on. So, or even sensitivity.
Have you got any examples of anybody you'd say has done it or is doing it well, and what was their architecture to deal with that?
To be honest with you, no. No,
That's
because I still feel like
very telling, isn't it? That there's nobody you can point to.
yeah.
It's like
Well,
it's such a different way of working.
well, I think the reason for that is because there's so many different ways to skin this cat, right? Like you said, every customer deployment is quite different, depending on what vendors they're working with, what capabilities are available to them, what skills they have in-house as well, what vendors they might be working with, the partner and so
Yeah.
on. So it varies from one to the next. But the other thing is, this is still quite nascent. MTRs in terms of, a capability, if I want to call it that, are still, to me at least, still fairly new. Phones are quite straightforward, right? It's just voice.
Yep.
That's a straightforward workload. We know that we walk up to it, we push a button, we make a phone call. That's straightforward. But with Teams, there's a lot more moving parts compared to, say, some other vendors. I'm not going to mention other vendors, but again, with Teams, obviously,
you can mention them. We're all friends here.
Okay, well, there you go. So Zoom, WebEx, etc. I don't want to say their story simply because the challenges that they have are different, but it's pretty much one throat to choke.
I mean,
to a degree.
I think it is simpler by definition that they don't do everything. So, like,
exactly.
They're not,
exactly. It's that one word.
The identity story is not going to trip up their rooms because it doesn't.
No.
I mean, there isn't a massive identity product there that's trying to do something completely different to what the Teams team are doing. Yep. And that's the blessing and the curse of Microsoft. It's an amazing blessing that you have this stack play that one vendor can bring so much capability for a certain price point, but it definitely does bring in some complexity, to be fair.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. I mean, even like phones and Intune as an example, I mean, that's been sort of a bone of contention for years, right? There's been various different advices that have to come out so people understand how to manage that. And now, obviously, for some of these phones, Intune, is going away, for some of the legacy sort of models. Yeah. So, and again, there's only so much that you can do with Intune for phones anyway. So, and it's working with the Intune team to make sure that they don't put something in place that could potentially break phones. And I've seen that happen before, in our space, with Android device administrator obviously going away and so on. So, yeah. It keeps me busy, definitely.
Yeah, it's something I'm having a lot of conversation with about, at Comsverse, which you didn't bother to come to my talk, but thanks for that. But I did a whole session on what a team's product owner or service owner is and what the responsibility of that team is, and kind of trying to make the case that there isn't architecture, project, and ops anymore. Like it's a continuum.
It's true.
And I still see people trying to do projects like that. They're like, oh, architects made the decision, project deployed it, good luck ops. It's wait a minute, like the product's
doesn't work.
The product's changing as you're deploying. Like it's
Yep. Completely agree. That's a really, really good analogy and way of describing it. It's absolutely that, and that's exactly what I'm seeing in the field. And it doesn't matter how much. I mean, I have to do a lot of evangelizing to sort of LT, leadership, that kind of thing. I think the penny is dropping, but it's difficult because the way organizations are structured doesn't allow themselves to be lent towards that.
That's it, right? You can talk to any individual and they're like, and then they're like, but politics, architecture, history, budgets mean these are our towers,
Exactly, yeah. And it's practically, how do you bring that together as well? Because like you said, it's that pipeline is really streamlined, and it's almost like you kind of need a permanent sort of consultancy in-house to sort of handle all of that, and that's obviously comes at a cost, because generally with architects, people are dipping in and out of that function, and it tends to be more sort of reactive. Someone needs a solution for X, you just go away and do design, and then you step away, and then it goes into engineering, and they get on with it. And conceptually that worked in the old days, but in the new world doesn't really work that well at all.
I am seeing a couple of customers shift to having a legit M365 service owner or product owner. They haven't quite broken down the full towers yet, but at least they have someone who's thinking about like strategy and architecture, ops and project, and in a coherent way. And I think that's the only way to really be successful.
It is. I mean, most of the places that I've worked in where there is product management, you tend to see a better level of maturity in terms of that overall governance. And definitely better success. I mean, I almost see product management as almost a bit of an adjunct to architecture anyway, because again, they have to be tied into strategy. They've got to understand obviously what's coming down the pipe. They've got to know that platform, and they've got to work very tightly with architecture anyway. So it's a very responsible position, definitely, but it's a key position in terms of making sure that you stay ahead of the game and that you're working very closely with your service delivery managers as well as operations to let them know what's coming down the pipe.
I think it helps educate the business side of the business that there's a job to be done there as well, because again, there's like a perception of, we bought Microsoft 365. It's their service. Why do we need to product manage it? And it's like, it's not product managing the features of the product. It's product managing the change, the deployment, the adoption, the security risk, the governance. It's a very, if you can get the time, there's a really easy case to be made, which is like, do we agree or not agree? Someone needs to consider these changes. Do we agree or not agree? We're spending X millions. We should probably maximize this investment. But yeah, it just seems to be, again, friction is against us a little bit.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I'm not sure Microsoft are suitably incentivized to address that, I guess.
Well,
I suppose that's more of an internal...
I don't think they want to point out there's a lot to be done, right? Because it's not in Microsoft's interest to be like, this is more complicated than it sounds. But on the flip side, I think they do want to address it in the sense of they don't win unless the customer gets the maximum out of the stack. Like if the customer persistently says, this is really hard to manage, changes a pain, this is hard work, they're not going to go up to the premium license, they're not going to add extra capabilities, they're not going to maximize E5. So I think they do and they don't. Certainly in the sales cycle, they're not going to customers and being like, by the way, we're not saving you any operational money here. We're taking this to the cloud, but you still need all these operations. That's not a great story. But they definitely, when people have got it, they're like, your operational IT need to work in a new way to drive value out of this investment.
Yeah, but I guess I think the challenge is just materially, how do you make that happen? I mean, obviously there's the sales pitch, well, not sales pitch, but there's the marketing, I suppose, sort of element of that, with CSMs wanting to upsell. And again, there's good reasons for a customer to want to go from E3 to E5 as an example. But how do you materially make that into something real within an organization? That's a lot of cultural change that has to come from the top down. So it's a lot of fundamental changes to an organization to make that happen. And it has to be a desire for it. And unfortunately, with productivity and collaboration, everyone really takes it for granted, right? You see it, it's just IT, right? So it's not line of business.
No, I think unfortunately it's security, risk, and governance really that can make things change because they have a more visible impact to the business. So like we didn't have the right policies for GDPR, or we let some data sit or not sit in the right place. That the business gets the monetary risk or the reputational risk there. I think more. Even that still a challenge, but I think that's the thing that more is going to drive us a change. Is like we need a holistic view.
Yeah, it can do. I've definitely seen that in my experience. Organization, again, it comes back to, I guess, risk profile. And like you said, if there's a penalty for that from a regulatory point of view, so then you have to do something about it. But I guess the point I'm making is just driving that cultural change to get to, I don't want to say the nirvana, but at least something better than the current state, which is obviously we're managing these in the cloud. How do we do this in a sensible and an efficient manner that works for the entire organization?
Awesome. So last question, and we have to do another one because we've already spanned through like 25 minutes in no time. What would you like? You're doing lots of big projects. If you could control what Microsoft was doing, what would you change or direct focus on to kind of make life easier?
Ooh. That's a good one. I'd like to see more focus on, I think, maybe maturity of solutions. And by maturity, I mean as in sometimes Microsoft will release certain capabilities, and again with the cloud, obviously things iterate quite quickly. We get lots and lots of new solutions, or capabilities that come out quite sort of rapidly. But there can be sometimes a little bit of an oversell, I think, in terms of what that capability can do versus expectation. And I think it's sort of bringing that together because some things have been advertised, say, a year or 2 years in advance, and then they're still not here yet. And I guess that some businesses that, or at least that I've worked with, are really reliant on X feature coming down the pipe, quite rapidly to meet a really important use case. And I think it's just making sure that we can sort of close that gap between expectation, and reality. I think Microsoft could probably make that a little bit better because they're very heavy on the marketing now, obviously in terms of, pushing out these capabilities and let everyone know, this is coming, maybe Copilot as an example, this is all great and hunky-dory, but it's trying to make that sort of more material. Well, what does this mean to me as an organization? What can I do with this? How is this materially going to benefit me? Because you've got to put that into layman's speak, for your engineers, for your admins, maybe for your leadership, so that they actually know, well, what does this do? Why do I need to be excited? What is it going to actually improve? I'm not a believer in talking about things in sort of nebulous terms. To me, you've got to keep it quite empirical, as in quite real.
Yeah.
So, show us what material this is actually good. Like a phone, we know what a phone is. It's easy to sell the benefit of that. But with something like I don't know, whatever the feature might be, like I said, I'll just use Copilot as an example. Well, why do I need to use that?
Copilot's the example at the moment, right? It's being pushed very hard. There's lots of value there,
Yeah.
but getting to the value and articulating the value is definitely non-trivial.
Yeah, exactly, and that's kind of what I've seen. I think in the projects that I've been involved in. Again, there's lots of great features in Copilot that we do know about, and I guess the other thing is, as techies, we're on the forefront, I suppose, of that technology, and if we don't understand it, it becomes even harder for us to articulate that to people who aren't that technical anyway, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's important that we've got a good grasp of, okay, well, what are we actually pushing here? What problem are we solving? Because in the early days, we obviously had all the flagship products, SharePoint, Exchange, Active Directory, Link, and so on. We knew what they were, we knew what they did, but we're kind of almost the other way around now, where we've got new technology coming out, but then we've got to try and understand, well, what is the use case? So it's kind of things have almost sort of flipped on their head a bit for me.
And so much changing across the entire stack, and being aware of what's going on across the stack is a full-time gig as well.
It absolutely is. Yeah, staying in front of all of that literally is a full-time job. I mean, like you said, the amount of change that comes, through the products now is it's almost mind-blowing. You could be an SME in something one day, and then the day later it's almost kind of redundant, which is quite amazing, right?
Yeah.
And that's the rate of change we see with MTRs, phones and so on, right? At least from a management point of view, so much change. And I think maybe it's something for the CSMs potentially to make sure they really stay on the ball with customers, to let them know that this stuff is coming, and really, whether that's getting on the phone or getting them on meetings, regular cadences, regular updates, not just leaving it to the message center, because some of this stuff is really quite important. You don't want to end up with, like I said, a major incident, because of some change that Microsoft have made there, and that maybe is going to bolster security or improve the service, because ultimately it's evergreen, right? And you've got to keep up.
Yeah.
So, and that's a difficult thing, I think, for a lot of suppliers. I've seen, much less organizations.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing, mate. Appreciate, I'll say it on the pod. Appreciate all the support over the years with the user group and stuff. And thanks for giving us your perspective and telling us the journey. I'm gonna pull you back for another one maybe in 6 months or so, and we'll see what the current hot topics are.
Yep, no problem.
Cool. If people want to find you, mate, what's the best thing to do? Do you want to be found?
Not these days. Probably LinkedIn's probably the best to find me on. I'm probably the most busiest on there. So yeah, just find my LinkedIn handle.
Awesome.
Shawn Harry, right in the corner. So, yeah.
Thanks, Shawn.
Yep, cool. No worries.